the night shift. It was late October, and the crisp autumn air was beginning to creep through the old windows of Crestwood High School. The school had been there for decades, its long corridors and towering architecture a staple in the small town. Many students would tell stories about how haunted the place was, but no one ever took it seriously. That is, until Mr. Carson, the night janitor, shared his terrifying experience. Mr. Carson had worked at Crestwood for over 20 years. His job was simple: clean up after the day's activities, check that everything was in place, and lock up the building by 11 p.m. It was routine, nothing out of the ordinary. But on this particular night, something would shake his view of the school forever. The evening started as usual. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the empty hallways as he pushed his cleaning cart from one room to the next. The fluorescent lights flickered above him, casting long shadows against the chipped lockers. The school was eerily quiet, with only the soft hum of electricity and the occasional creak of the building settling. As he made his way to the third floor, a strange feeling of unease washed over him. This part of the school was rarely used, only reserved for storage and the occasional club meeting. The air felt heavier, colder even, as though someone had opened a window. But all the windows were sealed shut for the season. It was when Mr. Carson was mopping the hallway near room 302 that he first heard a faint whisper. He paused, thinking it might have been the wind, or perhaps his own imagination playing tricks on him. After all, it had been a long shift. He shrugged it off and continued cleaning, but the whispering persisted. It grew louder, more distinct, like several voices all speaking at once. Mr. Carson's heart began to race. He leaned his mop against the wall and cautiously approached room 302. The door was slightly ajar, though he was sure he'd locked all the rooms earlier that evening. As he pushed the door open, the whisper stopped. Silence filled the room, but the sense of being watched lingered heavily. Inside, the room was as it had always been: dusty desks lined up in neat rows, an old chalkboard with faded writing from a lesson long forgotten. The air was thick with dust, undisturbed for weeks, but there was something else, a strange cold spot near the back of the room. As Mr. Carson approached, he noticed a single desk chair rocking slowly, back and forth, as if someone had just gotten up. He stood frozen in place, unable to explain what he was seeing. The whispers had stopped, but the eerie feeling was overwhelming. He quickly turned to leave, but as soon as he reached the door, he heard it again this time, a low, guttural voice that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. Leave now, before it's too late. Terrified, Mr. Carson slammed the door shut and hurried back down the hallway. His once steady, echoing footsteps were now rapid, uneven. But as he made his way toward the staircase, he saw something that stopped him dead in his tracks: shadows. Not just any shadows, but the distinct silhouettes of children. They stood at the far end of the hallway, motionless. Their shapes were faint, almost like mist, but there was no mistaking the small figures. They were just standing there, watching him. He blinked, hoping his eyes were playing tricks, but the shadows remained. Panic surged through him as he turned and rushed toward the stairs, but the whispers returned, louder now, almost deafening. They seemed to come from every direction, swirling around him as if the school itself was alive with unseen forces. Mr. Carson finally made it back to the main floor, heart pounding, when he heard a loud bang echo from upstairs. The sound sent a jolt of fear through his body. He debated leaving immediately, but his sense of duty pulled him back. He had to make sure the school was secure before he could leave. Reluctantly, he ascended the stairs again, this time clutching his flashlight tightly. As he reached the third floor, the banging continued louder and more frantic. It was coming from inside room 302. Slowly he approached the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the knob. When he opened it, the sight before him made his blood run cold. Desks were overturned, papers scattered everywhere, and at the center of the chaos was an old wooden desk, one that hadn't been used in decades. It was tipped over, but what caught his eye was the deep scratch marks that lined the floor beneath it. The marks looked fresh, as if something had been violently dragged across the room. Suddenly, the air in the room grew ice cold, and for the first time, Mr. Carson felt it: something dark, something evil. He didn't wait for another sign. He sprinted out of the room, down the stairs, and out of the building, not stopping until he reached his car. The next day, Mr. Carson reported what happened to the school administration, but they dismissed his claims as stress and fatigue. However, after a little digging, he found an unsettling piece of Crestwood's history that no one seemed to remember decades ago. A fire had broken out on the third floor, killing several students who had been trapped in room 302. Their bodies were never recovered, and the room had been closed off for years before being reopened for storage. Mr. Carson never worked another night shift at Crestwood. But to this day, students still report strange occurrences on the third floor, whispers in the hallways, shadowy figures standing in the dark, and cold spots near room 302. Some say the spirits of those lost in the fire still wander the halls, trapped in the place where their lives were taken too soon. And every night they wait for someone to join them in their eternal haunting.